Hello, fellow Planeswalkers, it's Scott, and we're back with more Wilds of Eldraine spoilers for Tuesday, the 8th day of Wilds of Eldraine spoiler season. We're coming to you on the Caffeinated Gamers YouTube channel, and remember to like and subscribe so you can get further content like this throughout Wilds of Eldraine spoiler season, and then additional videos during Wilds of Eldraine standard season. So let's get started with today's previews. We got a lot of them. One we missed from yesterday was Pollen-Shield Hare. For 1 and a white mana, you get a rabbit that's a 2/2, and creature tokens you control get +1/+1. So this is a creature token lord, and there are a lot of different cards in white that create creature tokens. So because of that, I think this is definitely something that is playable in standard, and I think if we do get a deck that's truly token dedicated, this is an outstanding card to put in that deck. It also is an adventure card, and you get Hare Raising for a green mana, and target creature you control gains vigilance and gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is a number of creatures you control. So that ability also, I think in the late game, you can cast that onto one of your creatures. Hopefully that's something that has trample, and then you can go ahead and cast Pollen-Shield Hare later on that same turn, and you get the bonus of having both sides of the card on the field at the same time. So I think this is going to find a home somewhere in standard in one of those token based decks. Next we have the Irencrag. For 2 mana, you get a legendary artifact that taps for colorless mana, and whenever a legendary creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may have the Irencrag become a legendary equipment artifact named Everflame Hero's Legacy. If you do, it gains equip 3, and the equipped creature gets +3/+3 and loses all other abilities. So I think this is a very good card for standard. First, having a 2 mana cost for a mana rock is a great value. Typically in standard we see them for 3 mana. So because of that, I think this will see standard play because of that ability in and of itself. Now, also because you can convert it into a legendary equipment when you play a legendary creature, I think it's got some actual really decent standard playability in the Legends deck, because we've also seen in that Legends deck some additional creatures that aren't legendary. So what you could do is you cast a legendary creature spell, and then you attach it to one of your non-legendary creatures, so you don't lose any of the abilities of that particular creature, and you can go out, hit your opponent for 5 or 6 because of the added power and toughness. So I think an interesting card that has some standard playability. Next, we've got Elusive Otter. For 1 blue mana, you get an otter. That's a 1/1 with prowess. And creatures with power less than Elusive Otter's power cannot block it. So that's a really nice ability for this card, because if you look at it in the big scheme of things, usually when we're seeing prowess activation, there's one maybe 2 a turn. So that means the 1/1 creatures that your opponent has can't block it in combat. And early in the game, that's probably enough to get in that extra little bit of damage that might be all the difference in the game. Now, it's also an adventure card. You get Grove's Bounty for X and a green mana. It's a sorcery. You get to distribute X +1/+1 counters among any number of target creatures you control. So I think early in the game, you're just playing Elusive Otter because it's a good card. And then late in the game, you can use the adventure side of it, use your mana to create +1/+1 counters and put on a target creature or creatures you control, and then cast Elusive Otter and go about your business. Definitely playable. I think, in my judgment, right now the best place for it is in the Is It Spells decks alongside Monastery Swiftspear. It's a great 1/2 combination for 1 mana a piece. So that deck is getting more and more support, so I think we're going to see that deck have a real shot in standard in the upcoming Wilds of Eldraine season, and I think you could splash a little bit of green so you can take advantage of the adventure here too. Next, we've got Questing Druid. For 1 and a green mana, you get a human druid That's a 1/1. And whenever you cast a spell that's white, blue, black, or red, put a +1/+1 counter on Questing Druid. So this is meant to be in a multicolor deck. And obviously, because we still have the tri-lands from the Streets of New Capenna set, getting it into 3 colors isn't really difficult for us, and we have so many dual lands. We're getting some more from this set, so I think that's really not an issue for us in terms of being able to pair this card with white, blue, black, or red cards. And obviously it's got an adventure on it, which is Seek the Beast for 1 and a red mana. You get an instant. Exile the top 2 cards of your library until your next end step. You may play those cards. So you get an ability that we already see in Standard for 2 mana on Questing Druid, Seek the Beast, where you're going to exile 2 cards, and then you get the advantage of when you cast those cards, assuming that they're red cards, then you get to go ahead and put a +1/+1 counter on Questing Druid. So I think this has the potential to be a very, very good card. But obviously, when it comes into play, it's just a 1/1, and a lot of things can kill it. Next, we've got another green card, Mosswood Dreadknight for 1 and a green mana. You get a human knight with trample. That's a 3/2. And when Dreadmoss Knight dies, you may cast it from your graveyard as an adventure until the end of your next turn. So the turn it goes into the graveyard until your next turn. Into your next turn, you can then cast this card for its adventure, which is Dread Whispers for 1 and a black mana. It's a sorcery, and you can draw a card, and you lose 1 life. And I think that's a great ability to pair with this. So you get card draw, and losing 1 life in black isn't that big of a deal. And what you get is a way to just bounce us back to the adventure zone by casting Dread Whispers, and then you can go ahead and recast it at a later point in the game. So our Golgari deck, I think, would want this because A, it's going to be some card advantage, and B, a card that definitely can come right back from the graveyard. And, you know, in any kind of reanimation deck, this kind of makes some sense as a way that it really just kind of reanimates itself. Next, we've got Sleep Cursed Faerie for a blue mana. You get a Fairy Wizard. That's a 3/3. It has flying and ward 2, and Sleep Cursed Faerie enters the battlefield tapped with 3 stun counters on it. If it would become untapped, remove a stun counter from it instead. So if you just let it go for 3 upkeeps, it will remove all the stun counters. You also have the ability to pay to remove one of those stun counters from it by paying 1 and a blue mana, and you can untap Sleep Cursed Faerie. And because you can do that at instant speed, so maybe on turn 1 you play this, you leave mana up for a counter spell on turn 2, you don't counter anything, so you go ahead and untap it. And at that point, you get it down to 1 counter on it. And then at the beginning of your next upkeep on turn 3, then you have all 3 stun counters gone, and now it's playable. Now, is that a lot of hoops to jump through? Yeah. I think that's going to be the downside of this. Or if we don't have another way to remove counters from it, which we sometimes do get in Standard, the ability to remove counters from cards. So if there's a card that could help with this and remove some counters, that would be really helpful to make this a little bit more playable. But I like the card overall because I think in the early game, it's a card worth having because maybe you don't get it for the first few turns, but for 1 mana, a 3/3, that by the time you get to the mid game, now is a pretty formidable creature. So because of that, I think it has standard playability in our Fairies deck. Next, we have a green card, Feral Encounter for 2 green mana. You get a sorcery. Look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may exile a creature card from among them. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. You may cast the exile card this turn. At the beginning of the next combat phase, this turn, target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to up to 1 target creature you don't control. So this is a really interesting card. So we're getting, for 1 mana in essence, you get to look at the top 5 cards of your library and pull a creature out of them. The limitation is you do have to play it this turn. So I think this is something that we would see played in the mid to late game to find a creature to go ahead and cast. But the ability to have one of your creatures fight another creature as well is a really solid ability. So I like this card a lot, and I think it definitely has, at a minimum, it's a sideboard card in green decks, and I think it has some main deck ability in standard in the right kind of deck. Next, we've got Food Fight. For 1 and a red mana, you get an enchantment. Artifacts you control have 2. Sacrifice this artifact. It deals damage to any target equal to 1 plus a number of permanents named Food Fight you control. So what this means is it's going to do 2 damage if you don't have another one. If you have 2 of them in play, you get to do 3 damage. If you have 3 of them in play, you get to do 4 damage. And somehow you have all 4 copies in play, you get to do 5 damage to target. So very quickly, this can take over a game and cause you to be able to kill your opponent relatively easily by just sacrificing artifacts. And we've got so many cards that create blood tokens or food tokens from this set that I think this is going to have no problem finding a home in standard. Where I think it probably has, at least initially, its best home is going to be in the Oni called Anvil deck. That hopefully this will help revitalize that deck. And if it does, then this will be a key card to helping drain your opponent pretty quickly to get a win. Next, we've got Restless Vinestalk. It's a land, and Restless Vinestalk enters the battlefield tapped. You can tap it to add green or blue mana to your mana pool. And for 3 and a green and a blue mana, until end of turn, Restless Vinestalk becomes a 5/5 green and blue plant creature with trample. It's still a land. Whenever Restless Vinestalk attacks, up to 1 other target creature has base power and toughness 3/3 until the end of turn. So this is an interesting creature land because the other ones have had some interesting abilities as well, but this one, basically can take any creature that has +1/+1 counters on it that may have entered the game as a 1/1, and that now give it base power and toughness 3/3, and that may be enough to prevent it from dying in combat, which would be a really helpful piece to any game plan. So again, with all the creature lands, these are things that will be seeing play across standard. Next, we've got Rankle's Prank. For 2 and 2 black mana, you get a sorcery, and you get to choose 1 or more of these options. Each player discards 2 cards. Each player loses 4 life. Each player sacrifices 2 creatures. So these are abilities that we've seen with Rankle before, and all of them are relevant in standard right now. Already we've talked about the fact that we've gotten several discard cards like Ego Drain that immediately go ahead on turn 1 and attack your opponent's hand, or turn 2 and attack your opponent's hand, and really turn the game into you have cards that you're able to play and you got the ability to play them, but your opponent, you're whittling their cards down until they're basically at the point where the only card they're getting every turn is a card they're drawing. And that can make a big difference in a game of Magic. If your opponent doesn't have resources, you have resources, it's a lot easier to win under those circumstances. And the other 2 abilities are relevant. You're playing mostly a control strategy, your opponent's got some creatures, you want to get rid of them, you can do that. Or you want to drain their life a little bit and you've got the life to allow it, you can go ahead and drain some life as well. So I think Rankle is definitely playable in the right kind of deck. Next, we've got our last rare of the day, Faerie Slumber Party. For 4 and 2 blue mana, you get a sorcery. Return all creatures to their owner's hands. For each opponent who controlled a creature returned this way, you create 2 1/1 blue fairy creature tokens with flying, and this creature can block only creatures with flying. So this is a card really I think that was designed for Commander, where you're playing 3 opponents, so you could, if they've got creatures on the field, this would create for you 6 1/1 blue fairy creature tokens. But outside of that, I don't see any application in standard. All right, so let's move on to some of our uncommons for today. And the first one is Hearth Elemental. For 5 and a red mana, you get an Elemental. That's a 4/5, and this spell costs X less to cast, where X is the number of cards in your graveyard that are instant sorceries and or have an adventure. And you can go on an adventure, Stoke Genius. For 1 and a red mana, you get a sorcery. and you can discard your hand and then draw 2 cards. So that's one of those abilities that I really like in red decks, where it's saying, hey, discard your hand, but if you do this at the right point, you may not have a hand. So you really just, it's 2 mana red, draw 2 cards. And I think in the right situation, that's where this card could shine as just a card draw engine. Now, it is very reminiscent to Tolarian Terror, which we see a lot of play in the blue spells deck, where for the most part you're seeing Tolarian Terror enter the battlefield for only 1 blue mana, and then it's in the fact that it's a 5/5 and has ward, makes it a really difficult creature for your opponent to remove. And Hearth Elemental, basically, if you look at the abilities, it's almost the exact card with 1 less power and without the ward, but you also can have adventure cards be something that counts towards getting it on the battlefield. So I think these cards together may form some kind of another spell deck that could be formed around these kind of cards, where you're casting lots of instants and sorceries and then throwing these big hitters down in the mid game and then using them to finish off your opponent. Next, we've got Aquatic Alchemist. For 1 and a blue mana, you get an elemental with an adventure. It's a 1/3, and whenever you cast your first instant or sorcery spell each turn, Aquatic Alchemist gets +2/+0 until end of turn. So, limited playable ability here for sure. Then we've got Bubble Up. For 2 and a blue mana, you get a sorcery where you put target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard on top of your library. So that's a pretty good ability to be able to move something from your graveyard that would be valuable in terms of an instant or sorcery. Maybe you're going to bring back a Memory Deluge so you can cast it for 4 instead of 7, or something like that that's a card draw engine for you that you're going to put on the top of your deck to really go ahead and dig into your cards. Now, like I said, this is probably mostly a limited playable card. I really don't see it having much standard real playability. Next, we've got Disdainful Stroke. For 1 and a blue mana, you get an instant that counters target spell with mana value 4 or greater. This is one of our 2 reprints for the day, and we see this played in sideboards in most blue decks. Next, we've got Succumb to the Cold. For 2 and a blue mana, you get an instant. Tap 1 or 2 target creatures an opponent controls, put a stun counter on each of them. Again, this is a card that potentially fits into the Hilda deck, and because we're seeing so many of these abilities, I think there's going to be a lot of support for that deck. It's certainly in limited. This is a good limited card for you in blue because it's taking 2 creatures out of combat potentially and making them stay out of combat for at least 2 turns. So that can be all you need to win the game. Next, we've got Snare Master Sprite. For 1 blue mana, you get a 1/1 Faerie Wizard with flying. And when Snare Master Sprite enters the battlefield, you may pay 2. When you do, tap target creature an opponent controls and put a stun counter on it. So for 2 mana, you can do the Succumb to Cold ability of tapping the creature and then putting that stun counter on it so it's down for a couple of turns. Early in the game, you're probably not doing that, but late in the game, potentially that could be all the difference between being able to attack through to win a game or being kind of board locked. So I think this is something that there'll be a couple of copies at least in our Fairies deck. And we've gotten a lot of really good 1-drop Fairies, and we already have a few in Standard already. So I think that deck really will find a place in Standard. Next, we've got some black cards for the day. We start with Scream Puff. For 4 and a black mana, you get a horror. That's a 4/5 with Death Touch. When Scream Puff deals combat damage to a player, create a food token. This is really a limited card that I think is going to be very good as a top end of any black limited deck, because Death Touch, 4/5, that's going to be hard for anybody to deal with in a limited format. Outside of that, not really standard playable because we simply have better stuff at the 5-drop spot. Next, we've got Candy Grapple. For 1 and a black mana, you get an instant with Bargain. Target creature gets -3/-3 until end of turn. If this spell was bargained, that creature gets -5/-5 until end of turn instead. So nice little removal spell in limited. Doesn't really have standard playability simply because we've already got a bunch of good removal cards in black in standard. Next, we've got Dream Spoiler. For 3 and a black mana, you get a Faerie Warlock. That's a 2/2 with flying. And whenever you cast a spell during an opponent's turn, up to 1 target creature an opponent controls get -1/-1 until end of turn. So interesting application here where you're able to, in essence, hurt your opponent's creatures on their turn, potentially killing some things that are 1/1s, or potentially reducing the power and toughness of a creature to the point where one of your creatures can block it, and instead of trading with it, now you win that combat. Now, is this something that's going to see a lot of play in standard? Probably not, because of the 4 cost. If it was a 3/3 or if it was a 4/4, definitely I think it's got a place in standard. But because it's a 2/2, I just don't see it as playable. Next, we've got the Witch's Vanity. For 1 and a black mana, you get a Saga. On Chapter 1, you get destroy target creature an opponent controls with mana value 2 or less. On Chapter 2, you get to create a food token. And on Chapter 3, create a Wicked Roll token attached to target creature you control. So there's a lot of value for this 2 mana. Now, is this something that black is going to immediately want in its main deck? Probably not. But this could be a good sideboard card for anytime you're playing against an aggro deck, because you put this in your sideboard, you got a couple of copies of it, they come in, you cast it on your turn to deal with their 1 or 2 drop, and then you get some value that goes beyond that. You get that food token, and then you get that Wicked Roll token for one of your creatures, boosting its power and toughness, and I think that's enough to make this potentially, in the right deck, a sideboard option. Next, we've got Barrow Naughty. For 1 and a black mana, you get a Faerie that's a 1/3 with flying. And Barrow Naughty has lifelink as long as you control another Faerie. And you can pay 2 and a black mana, and Barrow Naughty gets +1/+0 until end of turn. So because of the activated ability in limited, I think this is a good card, and you're likely to have other Faeries in your deck, so you're just going to end up with lifelink with the card, which in incidental life gain in limited is a really good ability, and I think that will lead to wins where you might otherwise lose. Next, we've got Unruly Catapult. For 2 and a red mana, you get an artifact creature. That's a construct. That's a 0/4 with Defender. You can tap Unruly Catapult to deal 1 damage to each opponent. Whenever you cast an instant sorcery spell, untap Unruly Catapult. So this reminds me a tremendous amount of Thermal Alchemist, which occasionally sees some play in standard, again in a spells deck. The Spell Slinger kind of deck where you can cast your spells, you tap it, do a damage, untap it, do a damage, and you're kind of pinging your opponent to death. Now, the advantage of Unruly Catapult is it's got 4 toughness. The downside of it is it costs 3 mana. So I think in the big scheme of things, we would rather use Thermal Alchemist than Unruly Catapult in any standard deck that we're playing. That's a Spell Slinger type deck. Next, we've got Witchstalker Frenzy. For 3 and a red mana, you get an instant, and this spell costs 1 less to cast for each creature that attacked this turn. Witchstalker Frenzy deals 5 damage to target creature. So we know that Sheoldred has 5 toughness, so there in and of itself makes this card potentially playable in standard. Now, in a mono red aggro deck where you're really trying to push and kill your opponents as quickly as possible, I think this has application, because you can attack with this and then attack with your creatures, then immediately before blocks are even done, then you can use it hopefully for 1 or 2 mana to go ahead and kill your opponent's Sheoldred or another large creature that your opponent has that you need to deal with to get damage through to win the game. So in the right deck, I think it's got standard playability. Next, we've got Redtooth Vanguard. For 1 and a green mana, you get an Elf Warrior with Trample. That's a 3/1. And whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay 2. If you do, return Red Tooth Vanguard from the graveyard to your hand. So we've got a little bit of recursiveness in an enchantment stack. Now, is it standard playable? Probably not. But in Limited, I think it's a good card to play, because that recursiveness in Limited is a very good ability to have. Next, we've got our second reprint of the day. Gingerbread is back. For 1 mana, you get an artifact creature that's a food golem. It's got haste, and it's a 1/1. You can pay 1 mana, and Gingerbread cannot be blocked this turn except by creatures with haste. Or you can pay 2 mana and sacrifice Gingerbread. You gain 3 life. Gingerbread played a pretty big role in Standard when it was legal during the time that Thrones of Eldraine was in play for Standard, because of that ability to go unblockable except by creatures with haste. And this, coupled with auras that were added to it kind of frequently, made Gingerbread kind of this small guy that would do 2, 3, 4 damage a turn and just whittle your opponent down. And we did have the kind of the Voltron deck where we're trying to, just build up one creature, and a lot of times Gingerbread would become that creature, because when you attack with it, you could pay that 1 and make it basically unblockable, and you'd get in your damage every turn, and in a couple of turns you would defeat your opponent. So I think this, again, will probably potentially have that kind of same standard playability if we've got the right cards to support it. Next, we've got Candy Trail. For 1 mana, you get a artifact that's a food clue. When Candy Trail enters the battlefield, you get to scry 2, and you can pay 2 and sacrifice Candy Trail. You gain 3 life and draw a card. So for 3 mana, basically, you get to scry 2, draw a card, and gain 3 life. Not bad overall, but not good either. In Limited, it's definitely a card I would want to be playing. Next, we've got our last 2 cards of the day. First, we've got Eritre's Tempting Apple. For 4 mana. You get a legendary artifact that's a food. And when Eritre's Tempting Apple enters the battlefield, gain control of target creature until end of turn. Untap that creature. It gains haste until the end of turn. So this is the first time in my recollection we've seen an artifact with the ability to take control of an opponent's creature for a turn. So that, for 4 mana, is a little bit high for what we tend to see with spells like Bloody Betrayal. Right now, it's 3 mana, you get the same effect, and you get a blood token. But this extra mana that you're paying does have some added upside, because you can pay 2 and sacrifice Eritre's Tempting Apple to gain 3 life, or you can pay 2 and sacrifice Eritre's Tempting Apple and target opponent loses 3 life. So you would be putting 6 mana total into it, but taking control of an opponent's creature and then getting to drain them 3 life as well. That really, I think, is enough to at least make it something that some decks may want to consider in Standard as a sideboard option. Next, we've got our last card of the day, Collector's Vault. For 2 mana, you get an artifact, and you can pay 2 and draw a card, then discard a card and create a treasure token. So this is a very interesting card to me. We've got a lot of things that want to have tokens to sacrifice, and this seems to me like a very good way to get those tokens to sacrifice. So certainly in Limited, I would want to play this card, because A, it's a card filter. You're ditching your lands for cards that you actually want, and you're getting treasure, which is ramping you. So I think this has Standard playability as well in the right kind of deck, where you're trying to dig through stuff to get to the cards you really want and then cast those and win the game. All right, those are our Wilds of Eldraine spoilers for today. Thanks to Caffeinated Gamers for sponsoring the video and putting it on their YouTube channel. And I will be back tomorrow with Day 9 of Wilds of Eldraine spoilers. I will see you then.